The morning light of October 28, 1894, filtered through the workshop windows at Bosendorfer's, catching motes of dust that danced above the half-assembled grand piano like notes made visible. Wilhelm Krauss, our protagonist, bent over the instrument's exposed mechanism with the focus of a surgeon, though his thoughts, as we shall see, wandered far from the immediate task. At 42, Wilhelm had reached that peculiar age when a craftsman knows his worth, but still questions his place in the world. His fingers, scarred from decades of handling piano wire and tools, moved with unconscious precision, while his mind catalogued the morning's concerns. The rent for his modest apartment in the Leopoldstadt district had risen again. His daughter Anna's millinery apprenticeship required new materials. And most pressing of all, though he tried to push it aside, was the tremor he'd noticed in old Steinbach's hands the previous evening.
"Kraus," the workshop foreman's voice cut through his reverie. "Letter for you. Looks important." The envelope bore the kind of expensive paper that whispered of old money and older traditions. Wilhelm wiped his hands carefully on his leather apron before accepting it, a habit born from years of respecting both his tools and his betters. The wax seal showed a coat of arms he didn't recognize, though the elaborate script inside commanded immediate attention. "Most esteemed Herr Kraus," it began, and Wilhelm almost smiled at the florid language that the nobility still employed, as if words could prop up crumbling estates. Baron Ernst Kellner of the von Hartmann estate requested his immediate presence for a matter of utmost delicacy regarding a Bosendorfer concert grand. The fee mentioned was triple his usual rate. Wilhelm's fellow workers noticed his sudden stillness. In the hierarchy of their craft, a private commission to a noble estate was both blessing and curse. The money was exceptional, but the nobles, they could destroy a reputation with a casual word at the opera house. "Trouble?" asked young Joseph, peering over his shoulder with the curiosity that would either make him a master or get him dismissed. "Opportunity," Wilhelm corrected, though the word tasted uncertain on his tongue. The workshop had its own rhythm, you understand, like a familiar sonata, played daily for 20 years. The gentle tap of hammers adjusting action parts, the whisper of felt being shaped, the occasional discord of a string being tested. Wilhelm had found comfort in these sounds after Maria's death 3 years ago, when silence had threatened to swallow him whole. But opportunities, genuine ones, were rare for men of his station. He sought out Steinbach in the senior craftsman's corner, where the old master sat examining a damper mechanism with a magnifying glass. The tremor was more pronounced today, though Steinbach's voice remained steady. "The von Hartmann estate? I remember the father, Franz Hartmann, brilliant composer, tragic end. Threw himself from the Kahlenberg 2 years ago, they say." Wilhelm hadn't known this detail, and it settled uneasily in his stomach. Estates touched by tragedy often carried strange requests. "Should I refuse?" Steinbach's laugh was dry as aged wood. "At triple rate? My boy, we're craftsmen, not priests. We tune pianos, not souls." But then his expression softened, and Wilhelm glimpsed the concern that had been growing between them, unspoken but understood. "Though, perhaps it's time you handled more of the major clients. These old eyes aren't what they were." The weight of this admission hung between them like a held breath. Wilhelm wanted to protest, to insist Steinbach had years left, but they both knew otherwise. The workshop would need a senior master soon, and Wilhelm, despite his skill, had always preferred the shadows to the spotlight. By noon, he'd arranged his affairs. Anna, practical as her late mother, packed his traveling case with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing without abundance. 3 days' wages in advance, she noted, counting the coins he'd drawn from the bank. We could finally repair the stove. Wilhelm kissed her forehead, marveling, as always, at how she'd inherited Maria's pragmatism, along with her auburn hair. First, your materials. A milliner without proper supplies is like a tuner without his tools. The train journey to Baden by Wien took him through Vienna's outskirts, where the city's grandeur gradually yielded to countryside. Fellow passengers included a mixture of merchants, minor officials, and a few well-dressed individuals heading to the spa towns. Wilhelm sat apart, his worn but clean coat marking him as respectable working class, neither seeking nor avoiding conversation. As the locomotive wheezed through the Vienna woods, he thought about the nature of sound itself.
Every piano had its own voice, shaped by wood and wire and the countless hands that had played it. But estates like von Hartmann's had their own acoustics too, built from tradition and tragedy in equal measure. The trick, he'd learned, was to listen not just to what was played, but to what remained unplayed, the silence between notes where truth often hid. The von Hartmann estate emerged from the autumn mist like something half-remembered from a dream, its Baroque facade both imposing and somehow melancholic. Wilhelm's boots crunched on the gravel drive as the hired carriage departed, leaving him alone with his leather case of tools and a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with the October chill. A footman answered his ring immediately, as if he'd been waiting behind the door. Young, perhaps 25, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested secrets barely contained. Herr Kraus, the Baron expects you. I'm Johann. The name was offered quietly, almost conspiratorially, though Wilhelm couldn't imagine why a servant would seek such immediate familiarity. The entrance hall spoke of better times, its marble floors still gleaming, but the gilt on the mirror frames showing patches of wear. A portrait dominated the main wall, Franz Hartmann himself, captured in oils with that peculiar intensity that marked true artists from mere performers. His eyes seemed to follow Wilhelm's movement, though our pragmatic tuner dismissed this as clever painting rather than supernatural observation. Baron Ernst Kellner descended the main staircase with studied elegance. His 51 years carried with the kind of dignity that required constant effort. Herr Kraus, how good of you to come so promptly. His handshake was firm but brief, the contact of someone who understood social boundaries perfectly. I trust your journey was comfortable? Wilhelm murmured appropriate pleasantries while studying his employer. The Baron's morning coat was impeccable, but there was something in the way he held his shoulders, a tension that suggested performance rather than natural poise. The matter is delicate, the Baron continued, leading in through corridors lined with musical memorabilia. It concerns my ward, Fraulein Elisabetta. The music room, when they reached it, took Wilhelm's breath away, not from grandeur, but from its peculiar atmosphere. The space was large, certainly, with tall windows facing the garden, but there was something about the acoustics that felt wrong. Sound seemed to linger here, as if the walls themselves were reluctant to let it go. And there, at the Bosendorfer Grand, sat the girl herself. Elisabetta von Hartmann at 19 was a study in contrasts.
Her pale fingers moved across the keys with genuine skill, but her thin shoulders hunched as if carrying invisible weight. She wore deep purple, not quite mourning, but close enough to suggest ongoing grief. When she looked up at Wilhelm's entrance, her eyes held that particular brightness that spoke of either genius or fever. "Elisabetta," the Baron said gently, "this is Herr Kraus, come to attend to the piano." She studied Wilhelm with unsettling intensity. "Do you believe in spirits, Herr Kraus?" The question hung in the air like a discordant note. Wilhelm felt the Baron's sharp attention, even while keeping his own expression neutral. "I believe in resonance, Fraulein. Every string creates vibrations we cannot always see." This seemed to satisfy her, for she smiled, a fragile expression that transformed her face briefly into something almost childlike. "Then you'll understand. Papa visits me every night at 11. He brings new music." Wilhelm had encountered grief in many forms throughout his career. The wealthy, he'd observed, often dressed their sorrow in elaborate costumes. Yet something in the girl's certainty, the matter-of-fact way she spoke of ghostly visitations, raised the small hairs on his neck. "Perhaps," the Baron interjected smoothly, "you could play Herr Kraus the newest composition, the one from last night?" What followed was extraordinary, and Wilhelm, despite his skepticism, found himself genuinely moved. The piece was complex, certainly modern in its harmonics, yet hauntingly beautiful. Elisabetta's technique was impressive, her emotional connection to the music undeniable. But as he listened with his tuner's ear, he noticed something else. Certain passages seemed to strain the piano's mechanism in unusual ways, as if the instrument were being asked to produce overtones outside its normal range. "Remarkable," he said when she finished, and meant it, though perhaps not in the way she interpreted. "Papa was always exploring new sounds," she said, her fingers still resting on the keys. "He says the boundary between our world and the next is thinner than we think. Music can bridge it." The Baron coughed delicately. "The piano has been difficult lately. Some notes seem to sustain longer than they should. Others create echoes. Elisabetta believes it's her father's influence, but I thought perhaps a more practical examination." Wilhelm nodded, already cataloging the symptoms. "I'll need to examine the mechanism thoroughly. It may take several days." "Of course. Johann will show you to your room. We dine at 7, though you're welcome to take meals with the staff if you prefer." As Wilhelm followed Johann up the servants' stairs, the footman glanced back nervously. "She wasn't always like this, you know. Before the master died, she was different. Happier." The room assigned to Wilhelm was comfortable enough, clearly meant for upper servants or visiting craftsmen. From his window he could see the estate's gardens, now autumn bare, and beyond them the Vienna woods stretching toward the mountains. Somewhere a dog barked, the sound carrying strangely in the still air. At dinner with the servants, Wilhelm met Frau Müller, the housekeeper who'd served the family for 20 years. Her 60 years had given her a careful way of speaking, each word weighed before release. "The master's death was sudden," she offered, ladling soup with practiced efficiency. "No one expected it. He'd been working on a new opera, seemed excited about it." "And the Fraulein?" Wilhelm asked, carefully. "Found him, poor child. At his desk, they say, though she won't speak of it. Frau Müller's expression suggested there was more to this story, but the arrival of other servants ended the conversation. That night, unable to sleep in the unfamiliar bed, Wilhelm heard it. Piano music drifting through the walls, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. His pocket watch showed 11 o'clock precisely. The morning of October 29th arrived with fog so thick that the estate seemed to float in a sea of white. Wilhelm rose early, his craftsman's habits unbroken by the strange environment, and made his way to the music room while the house still slept. The silence felt different here than in Vienna, not the absence of sound, but rather sound held in suspension, waiting. The Bosendorfers stood like a black mirror in the pale morning light. Wilhelm circled it first, noting the unusual wear patterns on the lid's finish, the slight discoloration near the music stand that suggested frequent handling. Every piano tells a story through its scars, and this one whispered of obsessive use, of hands that returned again and again to the same passages. He opened his leather case with a ritual precision that marked master craftsmen from mere technicians. Each tool had its place, its purpose, its particular weight in the hand. His tuning hammer, worn smooth by 20 years of use, felt like an extension of his arm. The various wedges and mutes, the specialized gauges for measuring string tension, all arranged exactly as his mentor had taught him, as he would one day teach another, if Steinbach's decline continued. Beginning with the exterior, Wilhelm ran his fingers along the case joints, checking for any separation that might affect resonance. The piano was only 5 years old, commissioned by Franz Hartmann himself according to the serial number, yet it showed signs of modification, subtle things, an extra set of screw holes near the pedal lyre, suggesting something had been attached then removed, a slight scratching on the soundboard access panel that indicated recent opening. The keyboard action came next. As he pressed each key slowly, feeling for the precise point of escapement, Wilhelm noticed something curious. The hammers in the upper register showed uneven wear, but not in the pattern typical of regular playing. Rather, certain specific hammers were more worn, as if those particular notes had been struck repeatedly, mechanically, without the variation that human playing creates. It was while examining the pin block that his fingers found the first wire. Thin as a hair, copper by its feel, running along the interior case wall where it would be invisible unless someone were specifically searching. Wilhelm's heart quickened, though his hands remained steady. He traced the wire carefully, finding where it connected to the soundboard through a tiny hole drilled with watchmaker's precision. Professional curiosity warred with caution. Whoever had done this understood both acoustics and the need for concealment. "You work like my father did." Wilhelm managed not to start, though Elisabeth's sudden appearance tested his composure. She stood in the doorway wearing a white morning dress that made her look even more spectral than the previous day. "Forgive me, Fraulein. I didn't hear you approach." "No one ever does anymore." She glided to the piano bench but didn't sit. He would spend hours with the instruments, adjusting things no one else could hear. He said most people were deaf to the subtle frequencies. Wilhelm carefully closed the section he'd been examining, his mind racing while his expression remained neutral. "Your father modified this piano himself?" "Oh, yes. He was always experimenting. Baron Kellner tries to maintain everything exactly as Papa left it." Her fingers traced patterns on the closed lid, and Wilhelm noticed they followed the same paths that had worn the finish. "He says it helps Papa find his way back to me." The sentence hung between them, weighted with implications Wilhelm wasn't ready to examine. A sound from the hallway, footsteps approaching with the measured tread of authority, announced the Baron's arrival before he appeared. "Ah, Herr Kraus, Already at work, I see." The Baron's morning attire was again perfect, though Wilhelm noticed a slight puffiness around his eyes, suggesting poor sleep. "I trust Elisabetta isn't disturbing your concentration?" The Fraulein was sharing memories of her father's work with the instrument, Wilhelm replied carefully. "It helps to understand how a piano has been used." "Indeed." The Baron's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Elisabetta, perhaps you should breakfast. Dr. Weiss will be visiting later." The girl's expression closed like a door. "The good doctor thinks I'm hysterical." "He thinks nothing of the sort," the Baron said with practiced patience. "He's concerned for your health, as am I." After she left, trailing reluctance like perfume, the Baron moved closer to Wilhelm. "You must forgive her. The isolation affects her mind. We've tried bringing her to Vienna for the social season, but she insists she can't leave the estate. Says her father won't be able to find her elsewhere." Wilhelm nodded while his fingers found another wire, this one running toward the bass strings. "The piano does show unusual modifications. It may take me longer than expected to understand them fully." "Take all the time you need." The Baron's relief was palpable. It would be good for Elisabetta to have routine activity in the house. She responds well to regular schedules. Left alone again, Wilhelm worked systematically through the instrument's interior, documenting each wire, each modification, building a mental map of what was increasingly apparent as an elaborate system. The wires weren't random. They connected to specific strings, creating a network that could, theoretically, induce sympathetic vibrations throughout the instrument. His discovery triggered a memory from his apprenticeship. Old Steinbach explaining Helmholtz's theories of resonance, how a tuning fork in one room could cause another to sing if the conditions were precise. But this was far more sophisticated than any demonstration he'd witnessed. The morning aged into afternoon as Wilhelm worked, and gradually the house came alive around him. Servants passed in the hallway, their conversations muted but present. He heard Frau Müller directing the cleaning staff, Johann's voice raised in laughter at some unheard joke from the kitchen. Normal sounds of a functioning household, yet underneath them, Wilhelm sensed the careful orchestration of people managing around a central disturbance. During a break to rest his back, Wilhelm stood at the tall windows overlooking the garden. The fog had lifted, revealing formal beds now given over to autumn's decay. In the distance, a small building, perhaps a gardener's cottage or storage house, sat at the garden's edge. Smoke rose from its chimney, despite appearing unoccupied, another small mystery in a house apparently full of them. Returning to the piano, Wilhelm made a decision that would have horrified his more conventional colleagues. He would not immediately report the modifications. Not until he understood their purpose, their function, and, most importantly, who had truly installed them. The wires were too new to be Franz Hartmann's work, the installation too recent. As he carefully replaced the panels he'd removed, hiding his investigation from casual observation, Wilhelm thought about trust and betrayal, about the lies we tell to protect others and the ones we tell to protect ourselves. The piano sat silent now, but he knew that at 11 o'clock it would sing again with its ghostly voice. And he would be listening, really listening, for the first time. That evening, Wilhelm took his supper in the servants' hall, preferring their honest company to the strained formality he imagined at the Baron's table. The kitchen maid, a cheerful girl named Greta, served a hearty goulash while casting meaningful glances at Johann, who pretended not to notice, while very obviously noticing. These small dramas of the serving class, Wilhelm mused, were often more genuine than the elaborate performances of their employers. Frau Müller presided over the meal with matriarchal authority, ensuring everyone ate properly while sharing household intelligence with the subtlety of a diplomat. The Fraulein barely touched her lunch again, she noted, her concern genuine beneath the professional distance. And the Baron has asked for the account books twice today. "Money troubles?" asked the cook, a stout woman whose name Wilhelm hadn't caught. "When aren't there money troubles in these old houses?" Frau Mueller's response was carefully neutral, but Wilhelm filed the information away. Financial pressure could drive people to desperate measures, even elaborate deceptions. As the evening deepened, Wilhelm excused himself, claiming fatigue. But instead of retiring to his room, he navigated the darkening corridors with the stealth learned from years of working in houses where servants were meant to be invisible. The estate's layout was becoming familiar, the music room at the center, the Baron's study to the west, the family quarters above, and that curious pattern of rooms to the east that seemed underutilized. He positioned himself in an alcove near the music room, partially concealed behind a heavy curtain that smelled of age and neglect. From here, he could observe the hallway leading to the music room while remaining unseen. The grandfather clock in the main hall chimed 10:30, its bronze voice carrying through the quiet house. At 10:45, Elisabetta appeared, moving through the hallway like a sleepwalker. She wore a white nightgown with a dark shawl, her feet bare despite the cold floors. Her expression was distant, focused on something beyond the physical world. Wilhelm held his breath as she passed within arm's reach, but she showed no awareness of his presence. The Baron emerged from his study moments later, watching her progress with an expression Wilhelm couldn't quite read. Concern mixed with something else. Anticipation, perhaps, or calculation. But instead of following her to the music room, he turned and headed in the opposite direction, toward the east wing. Wilhelm waited until both figures had vanished before moving. Years of adjusting delicate piano mechanisms had taught him to move silently, testing each footfall before committing his weight. He followed the path the Baron had taken, noting how the gas lamps here were turned lower than elsewhere in the house, creating pools of shadow between islands of dim light. A door at the corridor's end stood slightly ajar, revealing stairs descending into darkness. Wilhelm hesitated. Following further would be a clear breach of trust, yet his craftsman's curiosity had transformed into something sharper. A need to understand the mechanism behind this elaborate performance. The stairs led to what must once have been wine cellars, now converted to some other purpose. The temperature dropped noticeably, and Wilhelm detected a faint smell of machine oil mixed with something else. Chemicals, perhaps, the kind used in photography or scientific experiments. As the clock began chiming 11 above, Wilhelm heard it. A low humming, almost below the threshold of hearing, vibrating through the walls themselves. Then came the piano music, but here it sounded different, processed somehow, as if filtered through distance and time. He pressed his ear to the wall and felt the vibrations traveling through the stone, following pathways he could almost map in his mind. A shadow moved at the corridor's far end, and Wilhelm froze. The Baron stood at another door, his hand on an apparatus Wilhelm couldn't quite make out in the darkness. As the piano music crescendoed above, the Baron adjusted something, and the quality of the sound changed subtly, becoming richer, more otherworldly. Wilhelm retreated carefully, his mind racing to process what he'd witnessed. Back in the main hallway, he could hear Elisabetta playing, the music wild and beautiful and heartbreaking. But now he knew it wasn't entirely her creation. Somehow, the Baron was manipulating the sound, adding layers that transformed ordinary playing into something that could indeed seem supernatural. Unable to resist, Wilhelm crept to the music room door, now standing open. Elisabetta sat at the piano, her hair loose around her shoulders, her fingers flying across the keys with genuine skill. But her eyes were closed, her face transported, and she was speaking as she played, words too soft to catch but urgent in their rhythm. "Yes, Papa," she murmured between passages. "I understand. The diminished seventh, yes. Leading to the unexpected resolution." Wilhelm watched, transfixed and disturbed in equal measure. Whatever the Baron was doing with his apparatus below, Elisabetta's response seemed genuine. She truly believed she was communing with her father's spirit. The tragedy of it, the cruel manipulation of a grieving child's love, stirred an anger in Wilhelm that surprised him with its intensity. The music ended with a crushing finale that seemed to exhaust the girl. She slumped forward, breathing heavily, then began frantically writing on manuscript paper prepared beside the piano. Her hand moved with desperate speed, as if trying to capture something fleeting before it vanished. Wilhelm withdrew before she could finish, returning to his room by a circuitous route. He lay in the darkness, listening to the house settle around him, thinking about the varieties of deception. The Baron's mechanical trickery was clear enough, but what of Elisabetta's self-deception? What of his own, pretending to be merely a craftsman when he was now effectively a spy? Near midnight, he heard soft footsteps in the corridor. Johann, moving with purpose toward the servants' stairs. A few minutes later, another set of footsteps, lighter, probably Greta. Their small romance, blooming despite the strange atmosphere of the house, seemed suddenly precious. An honest thing in a place built on lies. Wilhelm rose and went to his window, looking out at the dark gardens. The small building he'd noticed earlier showed a faint light in one window. As he watched, it went out, but not before he glimpsed a figure moving inside. The Baron, perhaps, returning from his subterranean manipulations? Or someone else entirely, another player in this elaborate deception? Tomorrow he decided he would need to examine not just the piano, but the entire room, mapping the acoustic properties that allowed the Baron's trick to work. But more importantly, he needed to understand why. What drove a man to such elaborate lengths? What was the real purpose behind this ghostly fraud? The sound of Elisabetta's playing echoed in his memory, beautiful and tainted, like a perfectly tuned piano with corrupted strings. Wilhelm had come here to fix an instrument, but increasingly he wondered if he'd been brought to witness something else entirely. The slow destruction of a young woman's mind, one haunted note at a time. The morning of October 30th brought rain, steady and relentless, turning the estate grounds into a watercolor wash of grays and browns. Wilhelm worked at the piano with deliberate slowness, maintaining his pretense while actually studying the room's acoustic properties. Every few minutes he would strike a tuning fork and listen to how the sound traveled, building a mental map of resonance points and dead spaces. His concentration was interrupted by Johann, who entered carrying firewood, though the fireplace was already well stocked. "Herr Kraus," he said quietly, glancing back at the door, "might I speak freely?" Wilhelm nodded, continuing his work to provide cover for the conversation. Johann moved closer, pretending to arrange the logs while speaking in undertones. "That locked room next door, the old master's private study. The Baron goes there sometimes." at odd hours. "Many men keep private studies," Wilhelm replied neutrally, though his pulse quickened. "Yes, but Johann struggled with something, loyalty warring with conscience. Last month, men came from Vienna. Not the usual tradesmen. They brought crates, heavy ones. The Baron had them delivered directly to that study, wouldn't let anyone else touch them." Wilhelm filed this information carefully while adjusting a hammer that needed no adjustment. "You're observant, Johann. In this house you learn to be." The young man's expression darkened. "The Fraulein wasn't always like this. Before, she had friends visit, went riding, played the piano for joy, not whatever this is now." After Johann left, Wilhelm continued his work for another hour, then made a decision. The lock study demanded investigation. He gathered his tools, particularly the thin implements used for adjusting piano action parts, tools that, in skilled hands, could serve other purposes. The hallway outside the music room was empty, the household busy with midday tasks. The study door stood solid and uninviting, its lock modern and well-maintained. Wilhelm knelt, ostensibly examining the baseboards for acoustic dampening, while actually studying the lock mechanism. It was a Chubb detector lock, expensive and sophisticated. But Wilhelm had encountered its like before, when called to service pianos in banking houses. The lock yielded after patient minutes, each pin carefully set, while Wilhelm listened for footsteps. Inside, the room revealed itself as a monument to obsession. One wall was covered with manuscripts, some in Franz Hartmann's hand, others clearly newer in different ink. But it was the equipment on the main table that stopped Wilhelm's breath. The apparatus was more elaborate than anything he'd imagined. A series of Helmholtz resonators of varying sizes were connected by speaking tubes to what appeared to be an modified phonograph mechanism. Copper wires ran from this central device, through carefully drilled holes in the wall, the same wires he'd found in the piano. Most disturbing of all was a collection of wax cylinders labeled with dates and musical notations. Wilhelm examined one cylinder, noting a date from just 3 weeks past. Near it lay sheets of musical notation in the Baron's hand, with marginal notes. Elisabetta responded strongly to the diminished passage, "Incorporate into tomorrow's communication." Another note read, "The Chopin influence too obvious, must maintain father's style consistently." A leather journal on the desk contained more revelations. The Baron's precise script detailed his experiments with acoustic manipulation, references to Hermann von Helmholtz's work on tone sensation, and increasingly desperate financial calculations. One entry, dated 6 months ago, was particularly revealing. "E's talent is genuine but needs direction. Without the spiritual impetus, she lacks confidence to compose." The publishers are interested, but only in Franz Hartmann's posthumous works. The estate needs income desperately. This solution serves all purposes. She creates, believing it divine inspiration. I guide the creation toward commercial viability. The estate survives. Wilhelm photographed several pages with his mind, knowing he couldn't risk removing evidence. As he prepared to leave, he noticed something else, architectural drawings of the estate showing the network of speaking tubes installed throughout, connecting this room not just to the music room, but to Elisabetta's bedroom, the dining room, even the servants' quarters. A footstep in the hallway sent Wilhelm's heart racing. He moved quickly but quietly, replacing everything exactly as found. The door clicked locked just as Frau Müller rounded the corner. "Herr Kraus?" She looked surprised but not suspicious. "I was just coming to say lunch is ready." "Thank you. I was examining the wall's resonance." These old houses sometimes have unusual acoustic properties. It wasn't entirely a lie. At lunch, Frau Müller seemed inclined to talk. "You know, the old master had that study specially modified. Brought in architects from Vienna, insisted on specific materials. He said it was for his composing, needed perfect quiet." She paused, adding sugar to her tea. "Strange, though, after he died, the Baron had more work done. Different contractors, very discreet." "The Baron seems devoted to preserving Herr Hartmann's legacy," Wilhelm offered carefully. "Devoted?" Frau Müller tested the word like a dubious ingredient. "Yes, I suppose that's one way to describe it. Though I sometimes wonder what the old master would think of all this preservation." That afternoon, Dr. Leopold Weiss arrived for his appointment with Elisabetta. Wilhelm observed from the music room as the doctor, a man in his 50s, with the careful manner of someone who'd learned that truth and healing weren't always compatible, examined his patient. He was gentle with the girl, neither dismissing her experiences nor encouraging them. "The music you're creating is remarkable, Fräulein," Wilhelm heard him say. "Your father would be proud." "He is proud," Elisabetta corrected. "He tells me so." The doctor's expression remained neutral, but Wilhelm caught the sharp glance he directed at the Baron, who hovered nearby like an anxious impresario. There was knowledge in that look, perhaps suspicion, certainly concern. After the appointment, Wilhelm contrived to encounter the doctor near the entrance. "Herr Doctor, might I ask, professionally speaking, about the acoustics of delusion?" Dr. Weiss studied him carefully. "You're the piano tuner. An interesting question from a craftsman. I work with harmony and discord daily. Sometimes I wonder about their effects on the mind." The doctor glanced around, ensuring they were alone. "The mind, Herr Kraus, is remarkably susceptible to suggestion, especially a grieving mind. Add isolation, emotional manipulation, and, shall we say, artificial stimulation of the senses. You can create experiences that seem entirely real to the subject. And if one discovered such manipulation, that would depend," the doctor said slowly, "on whether ending it would cause more harm than allowing it to continue. Sometimes, Herr Kraus, the kindest thing is to gradually tune the discord back to harmony, rather than simply cutting the false strings." The rain had stopped by evening, leaving the air clean and sharp. Wilhelm stood at his window, watching the light in the distant garden house flicker to life again. The Baron was preparing for tonight's performance, another ghostly visitation to feed his ward's delusions and his own desperate needs. But now, Wilhelm understood the mechanism, the cruel architecture of the deception. The question that remained was what to do with this knowledge. Wilhelm spent the early hours of October 31st in his room, sketching diagrams of the acoustic system he'd discovered. The elegance of the Baron's deception was remarkable. Using Helmholtz's principles of sympathetic resonance, he could make the piano strings vibrate without direct contact, creating ethereal overtones that would seem to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was brilliant, diabolic, and ultimately tragic. A knock interrupted his work. Anna's letter had arrived with the Morning Post, and Wilhelm read it with growing concern. Old Steinbach's condition had worsened dramatically. His hands shook too badly now to hold even a tuning fork. The workshop was managing, but decisions needed to be made. "Herr Bosendorfer himself asked after you yesterday," Anna wrote in her careful script. "He wonders when you'll return." Wilhelm set the letter aside, torn between his duty in Vienna and the bizarre situation unfolding here. Through his window he watched Elisabetta walking in the garden, accompanied by a maid. Even from a distance, her movements seemed disconnected, as if she were navigating a world slightly different from the one others inhabited. After breakfast, he returned to the piano, this time with a different purpose. Using his finest tools, he began to trace each of the hidden wires, carefully loosening certain connections without removing them entirely. If he could gradually reduce the false resonances, perhaps Elisabetta might slowly distinguish between her own musical voice and the artificial spirit communications. "You work with such concentration," the Baron's voice came from the doorway. Wilhelm hadn't heard him approach, a reminder that he wasn't the only one capable of stealth in this house. "One would think you were performing surgery." "In a way, I am," Wilhelm replied, not looking up. "Every piano has parasitic resonances that must be eliminated. They muddy the true voice of the instrument." The Baron moved closer, and Wilhelm could smell his cologne, expensive but applied a bit too heavily, as if masking something else. Parasitic, an interesting choice of words. "Would you prefer supplementary?" Wilhelm asked, finally meeting his eyes. "Though in my experience, any resonance not intended by the original maker tends to be destructive over time." They stood there, two men engaged in a conversation beneath a conversation, each aware the other knew more than he was saying. The Baron's fingers drummed against his thigh, the only sign of nervousness he allowed himself. "The estate," the Baron said suddenly, "requires significant income to maintain. Franz was brilliant but impractical. He spent freely, assuming his genius would always provide. When he died," he paused, selecting his words, "Elisabetta inherited debts along with her gift." "And her grief," Wilhelm added quietly. "Yes, her grief." The Baron turned to the window. "Do you know what it's like, Herr Kraus, to possess refined tastes, education, artistic understanding, but lack the essential spark of creation? I've written music all my life, competent music, forgettable music. Then I discovered I had a different talent. I could recognize genius and shape it." Wilhelm continued working while the Baron talked, finding something almost pitiable in this confession. And the Fraulein's genius needed shaping. It needed believing in itself. She would sit at this piano for hours after Franz died, unable to play a single note. The doctors called it nervous exhaustion. Then one night I tried an experiment, just a simple acoustic trick, making the strings hum. She immediately went to the piano, said she felt her father's presence. For the first time in months, she played. And you elaborated on the deception. I gave her what she needed, permission to create, thinking it came from beyond herself. The music she's produced these past months surpasses anything she did before. Publishers in Vienna, Prague, even Paris have expressed interest. The estate will survive. She'll have a career. Everyone benefits. Wilhelm's hands stilled. Everyone except the girl who believes she's going mad. Does she seem mad to you? The Baron's tone sharpened. Or does she seem like an artist in full flower of her talent? It was a clever argument, and Wilhelm had to admit there was a twisted logic to it. Yet he thought of Elisabetta's hollow eyes, her bare feet on cold floors, her desperate scribbling after each visitation. "There's a doctor in Vienna," Wilhelm said carefully, "studying new treatments for nervous conditions. Perhaps if the Fräulein could be weaned from these episodes."
Gradually, the Baron's laugh was bitter. "Ah, yes, gradual truth, like slowly tuning a piano that's been at wrong pitch so long it might snap if corrected too quickly." He moved toward the door, then paused. "You have 2 more days here, Herr Kraus. I trust you'll complete your work on the piano and nothing more." The threat was subtle but clear. Wilhelm nodded, returning to his tools, but his mind was already working on a different problem. If he couldn't expose the deception directly without potentially destroying Elisabetta's fragile psyche, perhaps he could modify it, redirect it toward healing rather than exploitation. That afternoon he sought out Johann in the servants' hall. The young footman was polishing silver with mechanical precision, but his eyes lit up when Wilhelm appeared. "Johann, I need to understand something. These manifestations, do they follow a pattern?" Johann glanced around nervously. "Every night at 11, like clockwork." "But also sometimes in the late afternoon, if the Fräulein is particularly distressed. The Baron always seems to know when she needs comfort." Of course he did, Wilhelm thought. Those speaking tubes throughout the house. The Baron could monitor everything, know exactly when to deploy his ghostly interventions. "And the small building at the garden's edge?" Johann's expression darkened. "The Baron calls it his workshop, won't let anyone else inside, even has the locks changed monthly." That evening, Wilhelm made a decision that surprised him with its boldness. He would attend the 11 o'clock manifestation, not hidden in shadows but openly, as a concerned member of the household. When the time came, he positioned himself in the music room, examining the piano's pedal mechanism with a lamp. Elisabetta arrived in her usual trance-like state, barely acknowledging his presence. As she began to play and the false resonances started their otherworldly song, Wilhelm watched her carefully. Her talent was undeniable, but there was something mechanical in her response to the spirit communications, as if she were a sophisticated automaton responding to invisible signals. "The spirit seems strong tonight," he said quietly during a pause in her playing. She turned to him, her eyes focusing with difficulty. "Papa is always strong when the moon wanes. He says the veil is thinner then." "And what does he tell you, Fräulein?" "That I must continue his work, that the music must not die with him." Her voice broke slightly. "That he forgives me." "Forgives you?" But she had already turned back to the keys, lost again in her manufactured communion. Wilhelm watched her play, this girl caught between grief and genius, manipulation and madness, and felt a resolve forming. He would free her from this ghostly bondage, but carefully, gently, the way one removes old strings from a beloved instrument, preserving what was genuine while eliminating what was false. The 1st of November dawned crisp and clear, one of those autumn days that makes the world seem newly washed. Wilhelm had barely slept, his mind turning over the problem of Elisabetta like a complex fugue that refused to resolve. When Dr. Weiss arrived for his regular visit, earlier than expected, Wilhelm was ready with his carefully prepared approach.
The doctor found him in the music room, apparently absorbed in adjusting the piano's action. "Still at work, Herr Kraus. You're certainly thorough." "A piano is like a patient, Herr Doctor. Sometimes the obvious symptoms mask deeper ailments." Wilhelm didn't look up, but he could feel the doctor's sharp attention. "I wonder if we might speak privately after your examination of the Fraulein." Dr. Weiss agreed, and Wilhelm watched from a discreet distance as the physician conducted his consultation. Elisabetta seemed more present today, answering questions with clarity, though she insisted repeatedly that her father's visits were becoming more urgent, his musical dictations more complex. "He says time is running short," she told the doctor. "There's a grand work he must complete through me, a requiem for himself, he calls it." The doctor's expression remained professionally neutral, but Wilhelm caught the slight tightening around his eyes. After prescribing a mild sedative for her nerves, Dr. Weiss suggested a walk in the garden. "Fresh air and sunlight, Fraulein. Your father loved the garden, didn't he?" "Yes," she said softly. "He composed there often, before." Once she'd left with her maid, Dr. Weiss joined Wilhelm in the small morning room overlooking the grounds. The doctor closed the door carefully and took a seat that allowed him to watch the entrance. "You wished to speak about acoustics and delusion," he said without preamble. "But I think perhaps you want to discuss something more specific." Wilhelm made his decision. "What would you say, doctor, if I told you the ghost was manufactured?" Dr. Weiss was quiet for a long moment, watching Elisabetta's distant figure in the garden. "I would say that I've suspected as much for some time. The regularity of the manifestations, the Baron's peculiar behavior during my visits, certain inconsistencies in the Fraulein's descriptions." "You knew?" "I suspected. There's a difference." The doctor removed his spectacles, cleaning them with methodical care. "I've been reading Breuer's work in Vienna, his studies with hysteria patients. The mind, Herr Kraus, can create its own reality when reality becomes unbearable. Sometimes an external deception merely gives form to an internal need." Wilhelm described what he'd discovered: the wires, the resonators, the Baron's elaborate acoustic manipulation. Dr. Weiss listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as pieces of the puzzle fell into place. "The question," the doctor said finally, "is not whether we should end this deception, but how. Abrupt revelation could cause complete psychological collapse. The Fraulein has built her entire grief structure around these visitations." "I've been thinking," Wilhelm said, moving to the window where he could watch the garden. "What if the ghost were to gradually encourage her independence? If the messages began to change?" "You mean manipulate the manipulation?" Dr. Weiss showed the first hint of a smile. "Fight deception with deception?" "Think of it as retuning. You don't force a warped string to true pitch, you ease it there over time." The doctor considered this. It would require access to the Baron's apparatus and his cooperation or absence. The Baron is desperate for money. If he thought the ghost was instructing Elisabetta to complete one final masterwork before finding peace, he'd support it enthusiastically. Dr. Weiss stood, pacing now with nervous energy. "But we'd need to be extremely careful. The psychological balance is delicate. Too fast, and she breaks. Too slow, and the Baron might suspect." They were interrupted by Frau Müller, who entered with a tea service. The elderly housekeeper's eyes moved between them with sharp intelligence. "The Fraulein is asking for you, Doctor. She says she's remembered something important about her father." After the doctor left, Frau Müller lingered, arranging cups with unnecessary precision. "Herr Kraus," she said quietly, "I've served this family for 20 years. I know when things aren't right." Wilhelm waited, recognizing the careful approach of someone deciding how much to trust. "The old master," she continued, "was brilliant but tormented. His death, it wasn't the Kahlenberg.
He took poison here in his study. The Fräulein found him. The Baron convinced everyone to say otherwise, to protect her reputation and the family name. This revelation recast everything in a different light. Elisabetta's guilt, her desperate need for forgiveness, the Baron's ability to manipulate her grief, all of it made terrible sense now. "She blames herself," Frau Müller added. They'd argued that day about her marriage prospects. She wanted to marry for love. He insisted on an advantageous match. Such a small thing to carry such weight. Wilhelm felt the full tragedy of it settling over him like a shroud. This wasn't just about money or estate preservation. It was about a young woman haunted by genuine guilt, exploited by a man who understood her weakness too well. That evening he made another expedition to the servants' quarters, ostensibly to tune the old upright piano they kept there. The instrument was in worse condition than expected, but Wilhelm worked on it with genuine care, knowing that small kindnesses mattered in a house so full of deception. Johann appeared as Wilhelm worked, followed shortly by Greta, who brought him coffee and stayed to listen as he tested the newly tuned strings. Their obvious affection for each other, expressed in glances and small, unnecessary touches, seemed to brighten the dim room. "Will you stay in service after you marry?" Wilhelm asked casually, and both young people started. "How did you—" Greta began, then blushed. "I tune pianos for a living. I notice when things are in harmony." Wilhelm smiled, continuing his work. "The Fraulein will need loyal servants when things change here." "Change?" Johann's voice was carefully neutral, but Wilhelm heard the hope in it. "All things change. The trick is guiding the change toward something better rather than worse." Later, alone in his room, Wilhelm composed a letter to Anna. He told her about the estate, though not its dark secrets, and asked her to speak with Herr Bosendorfer about extending his absence. He also included a message for Steinbach. "Tell him I'm learning that sometimes the most important part of our work isn't fixing what's broken, but knowing how to fix it without breaking something else." Outside his window, the moon rose over the Vienna woods, and Wilhelm wondered what tomorrow's consultation with Dr. Weiss would bring. They were embarking on a delicate operation, not unlike replacing a piano's entire action while someone was playing it. The margin for error was virtually non-existent, but the alternative, leaving Elisabetta trapped in her manufactured haunting, was unthinkable. At 11 o'clock he heard the familiar sounds of the nightly visitation beginning. But tonight, knowing what he knew, the music sounded different, less supernatural, more desperately human. It was the sound of two broken people, manipulator and manipulated, locked in a dance that was destroying them both. The evening of November 2nd arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if nature itself was holding its breath before winter's arrival. Wilhelm had spent the day making his final adjustments to the piano, but his real work was preparing for the confrontation he could no longer avoid. The Baron had been absent most of the day, traveling to Vienna on what Frau Müller described as urgent financial business. His return at sunset brought a palpable change to the household atmosphere. Wilhelm watched from an upper window as the Baron's carriage arrived, noting how he carried himself, shoulders rigid with tension, the quick, sharp movements of a man under pressure. Whatever business he'd conducted in Vienna hadn't gone well. Wilhelm chose his moment carefully, waiting until after dinner when the household settled into its evening routines. He found the Baron in his study, not the locked room with its acoustic equipment, but his official study, where he managed estate business. The man was bent over ledgers, a glass of brandy at his elbow, his face drawn in the lamplight. "Herr Baron," Wilhelm said quietly from the doorway, "might we speak privately?" The Baron looked up, and for a moment his guard dropped completely. Wilhelm saw exhaustion there, and something else, fear, perhaps, or resignation. "Come in, Kraus," closed the door. Wilhelm entered and took the offered chair, noting how the Baron's hand trembled slightly as he poured a second brandy. "You've been thorough in your work," the Baron began, but Wilhelm interrupted gently. "I've been thorough, yes. Perhaps more thorough than you expected." They sat in silence for a moment, two men measuring each other across a gulf of class and circumstance. Finally, the Baron laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Of course, a craftsman of your caliber would notice the modifications." "How long have you known?" "Since the first full examination. The wires are expertly placed, but any master tuner would find them. Yet you continued working. Why?" Wilhelm considered his words carefully. "Because I wanted to understand the why before addressing the what, and because the Fraulein's well-being concerned me more than exposing a deception." The Baron's expression shifted, showing surprise. "You're not what I expected from a tradesman. And you're not what I expected from a nobleman exploiting his ward's grief." The words hung between them like a challenged duel. The Baron's face flushed, but then unexpectedly he slumped in his chair. "Exploitation. Yes, I suppose that's what it is. Though it began differently. Frau Müller told me about Herr Hartmann's actual death." The Baron's eyes sharpened. "That woman knows too much. But yes, Franz took his own life. The scandal would have destroyed Elisabetta's prospects entirely. So we adjusted the truth, and then adjusted it further with your acoustic machinery. You have to understand," the Baron said, leaning forward with sudden intensity. "She was catatonic for weeks after finding him. Wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat, certainly wouldn't play. The doctors wanted to institutionalize her. Then one night, purely by accident, a draft caused the piano strings to hum, and she suddenly said, 'Papa?' It was the first word she'd spoken in a month." Wilhelm could picture it too clearly. The desperate guardian grasping at any sign of recovery, the grieving girl seeking any connection to her lost father. "At first it was just simple effects," the Baron continued, "making the piano resonate at certain times. She began playing again, eating, speaking. Then she started claiming Franz was communicating with her, dictating music. The pieces were brilliant, better than anything she'd composed before. Publishers were interested. The estate desperately needed income. So you elaborated the deception. I gave it structure.
used Helmholtz's principles, installed the speaking tubes, the resonators. I studied Franz's compositional style, suggested themes through the acoustic manipulations. She would interpret them, expand them, create full compositions. The music is genuinely hers, Krauss. I merely prompted it. Through fraud, through necessity. The Baron stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Do you know what happens to young women without fortune or family? She has no other relatives. The estate is mortgaged 3 times over. Without the income from these posthumous compositions, she'd be on the streets within a year. And your gambling debts? Wilhelm asked quietly. Johann mentioned certain financial pressures of your own. The Baron's back stiffened. The servants talked too much. But yes, I have debts. Who doesn't in my position? Maintaining appearances, keeping up with society. It all costs more than the estate generates. So you're both trapped. You by debt, she by grief and false ghosts. The Baron turned back, his face haggard. What do you want, Krauss? Money? I have none to spare. To expose me? That would destroy Elisabetta completely. I want to free her, Wilhelm said simply. Gradually, carefully, but definitively. The ghost must release her, encourage her independence, then fade away. Impossible. The income will continue, but from her own compositions, acknowledged as hers. She has genuine talent, Baron. She doesn't need a ghost to create. The Baron laughed bitterly. You don't understand the publishing world. A young woman's compositions? They'd gather dust. But Franz Hartmann's last works, channeled through his devoted daughter? That sells. Wilhelm stood, moving closer to the Baron. Then we changed the narrative. The ghost blesses her work, passes the torch, declares his earthly business finished. She becomes not a medium, but an heir to genius. And if she collapses without the spiritual support, Dr. Weiss will help manage the transition. He's already suspicious and willing to assist. The Baron was quiet for a long moment, calculating. And what's to stop you from exposing everything anyway, after I cooperate? My concern for the Fraulein, and, Wilhelm added with a slight smile, my professional reputation. A piano tuner who goes about exposing family secrets doesn't get many commissions. They stood facing each other, and Wilhelm saw the moment the Baron's resistance crumbled. The man was exhausted, perhaps even relieved to have been discovered. How long? The Baron asked. A month, perhaps 2, long enough for the transition to seem natural. And my debts are your concern. But consider, Elisabetta as an independent composer, properly marketed, might generate more income than ghost stories. The mystery has served its purpose. Now it's becoming a prison. The Baron moved back to his desk, pouring another brandy with steadier hands. You know, Krauss, I actually loved Franz. We were friends once, before money and madness destroyed everything. I think he would hate what I've done to his daughter. Then help me undo it. A knock at the door interrupted them. Frau Müller entered, her expression carefully neutral. The Fräulein is asking for you, Baron. She says tonight's communication is urgent. The Baron glanced at the clock, nearly 11. Tell her I'll be there momentarily. After the housekeeper left, he looked at Wilhelm. Stay. Watch from the doorway. See the full performance before you judge me too harshly. They walked together to the music room, where Elisabetta waited in her white nightgown, her face luminous with anticipation. He's coming, she whispered. Papa says tonight is important, a revelation. The Baron moved to his position near the wall, where Wilhelm now knew he could activate the hidden mechanisms. As the clock struck 11, the room filled with that eerie resonance, and Elisabetta began to play. Watching her transformed face, her absolute belief in the deception surrounding her, Wilhelm felt the full weight of what they were attempting. They weren't just ending a fraud, they were dismantling a young woman's entire understanding of her world, one carefully planned note at a time. November 3rd dawned with frost on the windows, the first real sign of approaching winter. Wilhelm rose early, his plan crystallized during a sleepless night. He found the Baron already in the breakfast room, hollow-eyed but resolute, their conspiracy now binding them in uncomfortable alliance. "I've been thinking," the Baron said without preamble. "If we're to do this, it must be tonight."
I can't maintain this charade knowing you're watching, judging. Wilhelm nodded, spreading out a sheet of paper covered with his neat script. I've written what the spirit should communicate. The message must be clear. Franz is proud of her. His work through her is complete. She must now find her own voice. The Baron read it, his expression shifting between admiration and distaste. You've captured his voice well. Too well. Did you know him? I've been reading his manuscripts in your study. Also, Frau Müller shared memories of his speaking patterns. Wilhelm paused. She knows something is amiss, by the way. She's too intelligent not to notice. That woman has been the spine of this household longer than anyone. If she hasn't exposed me, she has her reasons. They spent the morning in careful preparation. Wilhelm made final adjustments to the piano, gradually reducing the false resonances while maintaining enough for one last performance. The Baron practiced the new message, using his apparatus to create variations on the ghostly voice. It was macabre work, two men rehearsing the death of a ghost that had never lived. At midday, Dr. Weiss arrived unexpectedly. I felt I should be present tonight, he said simply. Call it medical intuition. Wilhelm was grateful for his presence. The doctor's calm authority would be essential if Elisabetta reacted badly to her father's final farewell. They briefed him on the plan, and he suggested small modifications to ease the psychological transition. We should plant seeds during the day, Dr. Weiss advised. Mentions of completion, of cycles ending. The mind accepts difficult truths more readily when prepared. The afternoon took on a strange theatrical quality. Each member of the household seemed to sense something impending. Johann moved through his duties with unusual gravity. Greta hummed nervously in the kitchen. Even Frau Müller seemed to pause more often, listening to sounds only she could hear. Wilhelm found Elisabetta in the garden at 4 o'clock, sitting on a bench overlooking the withered rose beds. She looked up at his approach, and for a moment seemed entirely present, entirely sane. Do you ever feel, Herr Kraus, that we're all playing parts in someone else's composition? The question startled him with its perception. Sometimes, but even musicians playing written music add their own interpretation. Papa used to say that. He said every performance was a conversation between composer and musician, even when they were the same person. She stood, wrapping her shawl tighter. I'm frightened. Of what, Fraulein? That one day he'll stop coming, that I'll be alone with the silence. Wilhelm chose his words carefully. Perhaps silence isn't emptiness. Perhaps it's space for your own voice to emerge. She studied him with those unsettling eyes. You're kind, Herr Kraus. Kinder than you pretend to be. That evening, the household gathered in unusual proximity. Ostensibly, everyone was attending to their duties, but Wilhelm noticed how they all found reasons to be near the music room. At 10:30, he made his final preparations, checking the modified wires one last time. He'd altered them to produce a different quality of resonance, clearer, more defined, less otherworldly. The Baron appeared, dressed formally as if for a performance. "Are you ready?" "Are you?" Wilhelm countered. "No, but I haven't been ready for anything since Franz died. We simply proceed anyway." Elisabetta arrived at precisely 11, but tonight she seemed different, more aware, less entranced. She sat at the piano with visible trembling. "Something's changing," she whispered. "I can feel it." As the clock struck, the Baron activated his mechanisms for the last time. The resonance began, but clearer than before, almost like actual speech. Elisabetta's hands moved to the keys, playing a melody that was heartbreakingly beautiful. A farewell, though she didn't yet know it. Then the voice came, carefully modulated through the Baron's apparatus, but following Wilhelm's script. "My dearest daughter," it seemed to say through the resonating strings, "our time grows short." Elisabetta gasped, her playing becoming more intense. "Papa?" "I have given you all I can. The music within you now is yours alone. I must rest." "No!" Her cry was anguished. "I'm not ready." "You were ready before I left. My presence has been a crutch. You must walk alone now, into your own light." Wilhelm watched the Baron manipulate his equipment, his face a mask of concentration and something else, perhaps regret, perhaps relief. The message continued, each phrase carefully crafted to release Elisabetta from her ghostly bondage while affirming her own abilities. "Your music will surpass mine," the voice resonated, "but only when you claim it as yours. I release you, my dear one. Live, compose, love, be free." The resonance began to fade, and Elisabetta played with desperate intensity, as if her music could hold the spirit present. But gradually, the otherworldly quality dissipated, leaving only the pure sound of the piano itself. "Papa?" she called to the silence. "Papa!" But there was no answer. There would never be another answer. Elisabetta collapsed forward onto the keys, creating a discordant crash that brought everyone running. Dr. Weiss was beside her immediately, checking her pulse, her breathing. "She's fainted. Help me get her to her room." As Johann and the doctor carried her out, the Baron stood frozen by his hidden controls. "What have we done?" "What needed doing," Wilhelm replied firmly. "Now we wait." The house held its breath through the night. Wilhelm didn't sleep, sitting instead by his window watching the moon traverse the sky. At dawn, word came that Elisabetta had woken, calm but confused. She remembered the farewell, but seemed to accept it with unexpected grace. Wilhelm began packing his tools, his work here nearly complete. As he wrapped each implement in its cloth, he thought about the nature of truth and kindness, how sometimes they aligned and sometimes they diverged, requiring careful navigation between them. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Johann entered, his expression mixing relief and uncertainty. "The Fraulein is asking for you, Herr Kraus. She says she wants to play something for you. Something new."
Wilhelm followed him to the music room, where Elisabetta sat at the piano. She looked different, older somehow, more substantial, as if the ghost's departure had allowed her to fully inhabit her own presence. "I wrote this last night," she said simply, after he said goodbye. "It's mine, completely mine." She began to play, and Wilhelm heard it immediately, her true voice, freed from the weight of manufactured haunting. The music was still tinged with sadness, but also with something else. Hope, perhaps, or at least the possibility of it. The Baron stood in the doorway, watching his ward with an expression of genuine pride mixed with profound sadness. Their eyes met briefly over Elisabetta's head, two conspirators in an elaborate deception that had, against all probability, led to something like truth. The morning of November 4th arrived with unexpected sunshine, transforming the frost on the windows into prismatic light that scattered across Wilhelm's packed bags. He stood in his room one last time, observing how different the estate felt now. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted like fog before wind, leaving something cleaner, if perhaps more ordinary, in its wake. At breakfast, the household moved with lighter steps. Greta hummed while serving, and Johann met Wilhelm's eyes with something approaching a smile. Even Frau Müller seemed years younger, as if a burden she'd carried silently had finally been set down. "The Fraulein slept through the night," she reported, pouring Wilhelm's coffee with steady hands. "First time in 2 years without the laudanum." Dr. Weiss had stayed overnight, monitoring Elisabetta's condition. He joined Wilhelm in the morning room, his professional satisfaction evident. "Remarkable resilience," he said. "The human mind's capacity for healing, given the proper conditions, never ceases to amaze me." And the Baron left at dawn for Vienna. "Business," he claimed, though I suspect he needs distance to reconcile himself to what's happened. The doctor paused, choosing his words. "He left this for you." The envelope contained a brief note and a bank draft for twice Wilhelm's agreed fee. The note read simply, "For services rendered beyond the original scope, E.K." Wilhelm pocketed the draft but felt no satisfaction. Money had never been his primary concern here, though it would certainly ease the situation in Vienna, allow him to help Steinbach properly, perhaps even expand the workshop. A different knock came at the door, lighter, more hesitant. Elisabetta entered, dressed in a simple day dress of dove gray, the first time Wilhelm had seen her in anything but mourning colors. The change was striking. She looked like what she was, a young woman of 19, talented and wealthy, with life stretched before her like an unwritten score. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice steady but soft. "Not just for the piano, but for... I'm not entirely sure what, but I know you did more than tune strings." Wilhelm considered his response carefully. "Sometimes, Fräulein, fixing an instrument means addressing issues beyond the mechanical. Your piano will hold its tune better now." She smiled, a real expression that reached her eyes. "Yes, I think it will." She moved to the window, looking out at the gardens, where green shoots were already promising spring, despite winter's approach. "I've been thinking about what the message said, about my own voice. And I want to study properly. There's a conservatory in Paris that accepts women. The Baron says the estate can afford it now, with the income from Papa's final works. So the fiction would continue in part, Wilhelm thought. But perhaps that was kindness too. Some truths were too harsh for immediate exposure, like eyes adjusting slowly to light after long darkness. "You'll excel there," he said, meaning it. "Will you write to me? Let me know how your work progresses. I'd like to think of you sometimes, tuning pianos across Austria, making broken things whole." "If you wish. Though my letters are rather dull, mostly technical observations about humidity and string tension." She laughed, the first genuine laugh he'd heard from her. "I think I'd find that refreshing after all this drama." Their farewell was formal but warm, two people who'd shared something profound without fully acknowledging it. As Wilhelm's carriage pulled away from the estate, he saw her at the music room window, her hand raised in farewell, already turning back to the piano that would now sing only with her voice. The journey to Vienna passed in reflection. Wilhelm thought about the nature of deception and truth, how sometimes they intertwined like a Bach fugue, each theme supporting and contradicting the other simultaneously. The Baron's fraud had been reprehensible, yet it had perhaps saved Elisabetta from complete breakdown. The false ghost had imprisoned her, yet its departure had freed her more completely than simple truth might have managed. Vienna's familiar chaos enveloped him at the station, carriages clattering, vendors calling, the endless symphony of city life. He made his way to the workshop, where he found Steinbach sitting in the afternoon sun, his trembling hands folded in his lap. "Wilhelm!" The old man's face lit up. "Anna's been beside herself. How was the mysterious commission?" "Educational," Wilhelm replied, setting down his case. "I learned that sometimes the most important part of our work isn't what we fix, but how we fix it." Steinbach studied him with eyes that, despite their failing clarity, saw deeply. "You look different, my boy. Older, perhaps, or maybe just wiser." "Perhaps both." Wilhelm looked around the workshop, at the half-assembled pianos, the tools worn smooth by generations of craftsmen, the afternoon light slanting through dusty air. "I've been thinking about the future. Yours, mine, the workshop's." "As have I." Steinbach's voice was gentle. "Herr Bosendorfer visited yesterday. He wants to ensure continuity when I step down." "He asked specifically about you. They discussed the transition, the responsibilities, the need to hire and train new apprentices." Wilhelm thought of Johann, eager and observant, trapped in service at an estate that might not need so many servants now. Perhaps there were opportunities everywhere for new beginnings. That evening, Wilhelm dined with Anna, who peppered him with questions about the estate while updating him on neighborhood gossip. Her apprenticeship was progressing well. She had her mother's steady hands and practical mind. As she cleared the dishes, she mentioned casually that the young clockmaker from the shop downstairs had been asking about her. "He seems nice," she said, not meeting Wilhelm's eyes. "Respectable, steady work." Wilhelm felt time's passage like a physical sensation, his daughter becoming a woman while he'd been focused on other things. "You could do worse than a man who understands the importance of precision," he said, winning a smile. Later, alone in his workshop corner, Wilhelm unpacked his tools, cleaning and oiling each one before returning it to its place. Among his things, he found a sheet of music paper that must have been slipped into his case. A simple melody in Elisabetta's hand, marked for WK, who hears the truth in all things. He sat at the workshop's old practice piano, the one used for testing techniques, and played the melody. It was beautiful in its simplicity, honest in a way that all her channeled compositions hadn't been. This was her voice, clear and unadorned, neither asking for approval nor claiming supernatural origin. Through the workshop windows, Vienna's gas lamps were being lit, one by one, pushing back the November darkness. Somewhere out there, in drawing rooms and concert halls, music was being performed, some genuine, some false, most a mixture of both. But here, in this moment, Wilhelm played Elisabetta's simple melody and found in it something precious, the sound of a human soul, freed from the ghosts that haunt us all, singing its own particular truth. The piano needed tuning, it always did in this drafty workshop, but for once Wilhelm didn't mind the slight discordance. Perfection, he'd learned, was less important than authenticity. The true notes and the false ones together created harmony, or at least something close enough to it for the imperfect world they inhabited. As the last note faded, he closed the piano and prepared for tomorrow's work. There would be other pianos to tune, other problems to solve, other mysteries to unravel. But for tonight, he was content to sit in the gathering darkness, a craftsman at rest, carrying within him the strange and beautiful story of a ghost that never was, a haunting that became a healing, and the curious way that lies, carefully dismantled, could sometimes reveal deeper truths than honesty alone could manage. The city hummed around him, that great orchestra of human ambition and need, and Wilhelm Krauss, master tuner of pianos and perhaps of more delicate instruments, finally allowed himself to smile.